Well, howdy! Hey, good evening. It's great to be corn streaming into your living room tonight. I know that tonight just feels different even than the last 2 weeks. With Breakaway Worship in one location, I'm in a different location actually pre-recording this message. It's still daylight outside. But even with things feeling different, I love the fact that we can still gather together and lift up the name of Jesus together. And I'm so excited for what God has in store for us tonight as we step back in to Psalm 23. Before we get there, let me just say this. As I was preparing for this message, I was reminded of a movie that I saw in 2010 called 127 Hours. 127 Hours is a movie that tells the real life true story of a guy named Aron Ralston who was hiking in Utah. And while hiking, he dislodged a boulder, and that boulder came down in just the most unfortunate but perfect way to pin his right arm to a canyon wall. And so Aron Ralston was stuck or trapped, pinned with his arm against that canyon wall for about 127 hours or roughly 5 days. And as I thought about that movie, I just thought, you know what? I've never had my right arm pinned to a canyon wall, but I now know what it feels like to be stuck, unable to go anywhere. That's kind of the situation that we're in right now. All of us, in a lot of ways, we're just stuck. We can't go where we want to go. We can't do what we want to do. And as I thought about Aron Ralston's experience in that canyon, I can identify with some of it. Like there were times when Aron would yell for help, but it didn't matter. It didn't make a difference. And for you extroverts out there who have screamed into a pillow at some point in the last 3 weeks, you know what that feels like, to yell in some ways for help, but for no help to come. And as Aron Ralston was pinned under that boulder, he began to have flashbacks to all of the things that he had been taking for granted. And I'm like, I get that. Like, how many of you have experienced that just in the last week or two where you flashed back to things that you've taken for granted for so long, and now you're like, you know what, I just miss the days of like going out to eat. Like I miss the days of just being able to buy toilet paper whenever I want to buy toilet paper. Like I miss the days when I didn't look at everyone in the world as a threat to my health. Like I miss the days of like not being home. Even though I love my wife and I love my kids, it's so easy now for us to think about the things that we take for granted. And we know that when we get out of this coronavirus time, we know exactly where we're going to go. We know exactly what we're going to eat. We know exactly who we're going to go hug. Like I miss the days of like hugging family members. Like I still hug my wife and my kids, but I haven't seen my parents in a while. Like, isn't that weird? Like we have had no physical contact. I have not shaken another person's hand in weeks. So we get that. But there was this moment in 127 hours where Aron Ralston realized that he was going to have to make some changes in that canyon if he was going to make it. Like you see this moment where he realizes, like, I can't just eat all of my food right now. If I'm going to make it, I'm going to have to ration it. And then he had to shift his weight. He had to kind of rig up his harness to take the weight off of his legs so that he could conserve his energy. And then when nighttime came and it got cold inside of that canyon, he took out all of his climbing rope and he wrapped it around his arms and his legs to provide himself with whatever warmth he could. He realized that some changes had to be made if he was actually going to make it. And as I thought about that, and I just thought about where we're heading tonight, where David takes us, kind of the most familiar part of Psalm 23, when he talks about walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Here's the interesting thing. Every single one of us can identify with that passage now. Like normally we walk through valleys at different times. All of us are walking through a valley at the same time right now. Like how the valley of the coronavirus impacts your life looks different than how it impacts my life. But the reality is we are all walking through a valley right now. And so as I thought about 127 hours and I thought about our situation right now, where in a lot of ways we're just stuck, I realized that some changes might need to be made if we're going to make it spiritually. And so that's what I want to do tonight as we step back into our series, For You Are With Me, and we look at probably the most well-known part of this chapter in Psalm 23. What I want to do is I want to give you three things that might need to change in your life in the midst of this season if you are going to make it spiritually. So if you have a Bible, turn with me to Psalm 23. Psalm 23 is where we're going to be this evening. If this is your first time joining us, I encourage you to go back and listen to the first two messages in this series, but we're just kind of taking our time going a verse or two at a time through this psalm. And tonight we get to verse 4. Listen to what David says, starting in verse 1. Let's just read it. He says this, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake." Here we go, verse 4. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." So David is talking about times in our lives where we will walk through valleys, and he's very particular. It's the valley of the shadow of death. That means the valley of deep darkness. It could mean a valley where the threat of death even is possible. And so that's not too unfamiliar to us right now, that this is a time of darkness. This is a valley for each one of us. The first thing that might need to change if you're going to make it spiritually is this. You might need to change what you believe. You might need to change what you believe. It's important for you to remember who's actually writing Psalm 23. Who is it? It's David. Who was David? David became the king of Israel, but he was the person that God gave this title to. God referred to David as the man after my own heart. Like, there is no more flattering title that is given to a human being in the scriptures than that. The man after God's own heart. And yet here we see David, the man after God's own heart, the man who pursued God with all of his being. What do we see him saying? He's saying, I know what it feels like to be walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Do you know what this shows us? It shows us that bad things happen even to God's people. That's what it shows us. Bad things happen even to God's people. And don't forget what David had just said in the previous verse. At the end of verse 3, what does he say? He says, He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. What that is saying is he leads me on right paths. So what David is saying when he says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, what he's saying is, walking through the valley of the shadow of death is just as much a right path in God's eyes as it is to lie down in green pastures or be led by still waters. Here's what that means. God's paths for our lives often find their way through valleys. There are going to be times in our lives where God's path leads us through valleys that feel like there is the shadow of death, the threat of death, deep darkness in those moments. So here's what I'm telling you. I am telling you that God will lead us into situations and seasons where we have little to no control. There are going to be times where God leads you into moments in life where your dreams and your reality go in two totally different directions. God never promises us our best lives now. And so you need to evaluate, do your beliefs about God and how life should go actually allow for this kind of experience? Like moments like the coronavirus, moments like the one that we are in right now are very important in life because these moments actually show us what we really believe to be true about God. And what these moments can do is they can actually expose inaccurate beliefs about God and how life as one of his followers should go. I mean, just think about it. I would imagine that many of you watching this right now have at some point in the last 3 weeks experienced frustration or anger towards God. Like if you were honest, maybe you didn't voice it verbally, but if you were honest with yourself, you would say, yeah, you know what? I am frustrated with God. I'm angry with God right now. Why? Because he hasn't done what you think he should do, or he's not doing what you think a good God should do, or you feel like you have been dealt a hand during this time that you really don't deserve. Do you know what is happening? If you've experienced those feelings, what is happening is God might be exposing your current beliefs that don't actually allow for God's right paths to lead through valleys. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, pay attention to your feelings, because your feelings will inform what you believe to be true about God in this moment. Like if you are frustrated or angry with God, if you are disappointed in God, then what your feelings are doing are they are exposing inaccurate beliefs. And they're exposing the fact that your beliefs at this moment at least do not allow for God's right paths for your life to lead through valleys. The valley of the shadow of death. I've used this illustration before, but a couple of years ago, my 10-year-old and my 8-year-old, they were 8 and 6 at the time, they really wanted to watch the old movie Jurassic Park. They were really into dinosaurs and they really wanted to watch Jurassic Park, but I just wasn't at a point as a dad where I wanted them to be able to see dinosaurs devouring people. It just didn't feel like the right dad move. Fortunately, there was this app that came out called VidAngel. And what VidAngel does is it allows you to actually go through every cuss word, every inappropriate scene, every scene of violence, and you get to decide whether you want that scene to show up when you watch the movie or not. And so what I did is I just went through and I was able to edit out every single moment in Jurassic Park where a dinosaur kills a human being. And so there's this moment in Jurassic Park where this guy who was sitting on a toilet, all of the walls fall down, and he's just sitting there on a toilet, and this T-Rex is looking at him. And right as the T-Rex is about to just lean forward and devour this man, the movie just skips to the next scene. So as far as my kids know, that guy is still just sitting on the toilet. And I just thought about that, and I just thought that's the kind of experience that we deep down we want with God. We want God to go through our lives and edit out any scenes that would lead to discomfort in our lives. And so those times when the scene doesn't just magically change, and God leaves us in a moment to sit through pain, it can really rattle our beliefs in Him. And in those moments, we are forced to determine what we really believe to be true about God. So you just need to evaluate. Ask yourself this question, okay? Ask yourself this question: can God lead you through a moment or season of deep darkness and still be fully good, fully trustworthy, fully faithful, and fully worthy of your life and worship? If your answer to that question deep down is no, then during this time you might need to change what you believe if you're really going to make it spiritually. I just want to give you some perspective. As I've been preparing for these talks through Psalm 23, I've been reading through the book by Philip Keller called A Shepherd's Look at Psalm 23. Philip Keller was a shepherd himself for 8 years, and in his book, he talks about the rhythms of shepherds and their sheep. And he talks about the fact that shepherds will lead their sheep into higher country during the summer. It's common practice for them to do that. But in order for sheep and shepherds to ascend the mountains during the summer, they have to go through valleys because every mountain has valleys. And valleys can be places where there are predators, avalanches, poisonous plants, storms, floods along the valley floors. In addition to that, the sun does not shine into the valley very well. So there really are shadows, which at any moment can be shadows of death. But just think about what I'm telling you. In order for the shepherd to ascend the mountain with his sheep, he must lead them through the valleys. What does this mean for the Christian life? It means that in order for us to ascend to spiritual mountaintops, the path that leads to spiritual mountaintops where we all want to be, that path might lead us through valleys, specifically the valley of the shadow of death. A.W. Tozer, one of my favorite authors, he puts it this way. He says, "It is doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly until he has hurt him deeply." Here's what I need you to understand. God isn't just leading us through a valley. He is leading us to new heights with him. Can you just allow that to sink in, that when you find yourself in a valley, God isn't just leading you through the valley. He's actually trying to lead you to new heights with him. He's trying to lead you to new heights of trust in him, new heights of joy in his goodness, in his faithfulness. He's trying to lead you to new heights of surrender to him, because when you're fully surrendered to him, there is peace in that place. But in order for the pain that you might feel right now to be productive instead of pointless, you might need to change what you believe. As I was thinking about this point, I just want to close out this point by just acknowledging this just hit me last night as I lay in bed last night. I realized that a lot of times someone or something other than God gets the credit for the good times in our lives, and God gets the blame for the bad times in our lives. But if God is our shepherd, and if dark valleys are his right paths, and he is a good shepherd, then our aim during times like this must be to be grateful in the good times and faithful in the bad times. And if we're going to do that, our beliefs might have to change. The second thing that might need to change if you're going to make it spiritually during this time is you might need to change what you fear. You might need to change what you fear. Think about what David says. He says this. He says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." So even though David finds himself in the midst of the valley of the shadow of death, we find him walking in confidence and comfort instead of fear. Why? Because he has a strong awareness that his shepherd is present and prepared for his valley. He understands the presence of his shepherd, and it impacts his well-being. It reminds me, several years ago, my son Noah was about 4 years old at the time, and he woke up from his afternoon nap just crying. But the crying didn't stop. Like, he cried all the way up to dinner, then he cried through dinner, And he just kept crying. I mean, it just went on and on till probably 8 or 9 at night. And so as my son Noah just kept crying, like I began to evaluate all of the possibilities of why he was crying. Number one, he had a bad dream. Number two, he didn't feel good. Number three, he was possessed. Like those were the three options that I was evaluating. And we put him to bed and he is still he's crying the entire time. And so we hear him through the baby monitor. He's just still crying. He's still just unable to settle down. So it just reaches this moment where I grab my pillow and I grab a blanket and I go into his room and I pull out the trundle bed and I say, hey, dude, I'm going to sleep in here with you tonight. And he laid down. He stopped crying and he fell asleep because knowing that I was present changed everything. And I just thought about that, and I thought about David, and that is what we are seeing David experience. Somehow, knowing the character of his shepherd, knowing the presence and the preparedness of his shepherd changes everything so that David in this moment is able to feel peace instead of panic, and he's able to declare, I will fear no evil. He says, for you are with me. And then he says, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So it might be good for us to talk about the rod and the staff for a minute. The rod, a shepherd would carry two pieces of equipment. He would have a rod, which was a club, and he used it for two things. He would use it to protect his sheep, so he would use it against predators, and then he would use it to discipline his sheep. So if a sheep was wandering off, he might strike it with the club to inform the sheep, you are not doing what you're supposed to be doing. But then the shepherd also had his staff, and the staff is what we picture of shepherds, that has the crook in it. And the staff, while the rod symbolized the power and the authority of the shepherd, the staff represented the concern and the compassion of the shepherd. See, the shepherd would use his staff to maybe hook a sheep around his neck and pull the sheep close into him to examine him and to make sure that he's doing okay. Or the shepherd might take his staff and use it to direct his sheep. He might touch the sheep on the side to say, hey, we're going this way or we're going that way. Or there were times, Philip Keller talks about the shepherd. If the shepherd had a favorite sheep, the shepherd might take his staff and just put his staff on the side of his favorite sheep as a way of saying, hey, I'm here and I'm with you. David, as he walks through difficult times, as he walks through a season of deep darkness, everything is transformed knowing that his shepherd is with him. He has this sense that he doesn't have to walk 1 inch of the valley alone. Let me just ask you, do you have that awareness right now? In a time where we feel more isolated than ever, during this time where we have more alone time than we would like, do you sense that you are never alone and you don't have to walk 1 inch of this valley by yourself because your good shepherd is with you? But as David walks through this valley, he senses the power of God and the authority of God. See, remember that club represented power and authority. David is aware of the power and authority of his God, his shepherd. But not only that, he's aware of the concern and the compassion of his God and of his shepherd. And those two things form an amazing combination. When you're aware of the power and authority of God, you realize that God is all powerful. When you're aware of the concern and the compassion of God, you realize that he's not just all powerful, he's all good. And when you realize that God is all powerful and all good, then you know what you're able to declare. You're able to declare what David declared, I will fear no evil. You want to know why? Because you realize that your shepherd is greater than anything that could come at you when you're in the midst of the valley. Don't miss what I'm telling you right now. Do you want to know why David was truly able to declare, I will fear no evil? David feared his shepherd more than he feared any evil that could come at him in the valleys of life. See, in times like this, you know what we say? We say that we just need more faith instead of fear. And we position faith as the opposite of fear. But here's what I need you to understand. Faith isn't the opposite of fear. Faith is the redemption of fear. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Do you remember what happened when Jesus calmed the storm in Mark chapter 4? Just listen to the wording. It says this. The disciples run to him. They say, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" And look at how Jesus responds. It says this, "And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased and there was a great calm. He said to them, 'Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?'" Now watch this. "And they were filled with great fear. And they said to one another, 'Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" Do you see what happened? Their fear was simply redirected from the storm to their God. And their fear was actually faith in action. The disciples were now displaying what Jesus had hoped they had displayed when the storm came. Faith was simply redeemed fear. Do you know what it means to fear God? To fear God is simply to believe that He is always more. That's what it means to fear God. It means to believe that He is always more. He's always more than anyone or anything. And He's always more than you know Him to be. A good question for you to ask right now is, more what? He's always more what than anyone or anything? He's always more of what than I know Him to be? Exactly. Jesus, your good shepherd, is always more. He's always more powerful than anyone or anything. He's always more powerful than you will ever know Him to be. He's always more resourceful than anyone or anything. He's always more resourceful than you will ever know Him to be. Your good shepherd is always more loving than anyone or anything. He's always more loving than you will ever know Him to be. And your good shepherd is always more in control than anyone or anything. He's always more in control than you will ever know Him to be. See, when you begin to believe that the one who is always more is with you every inch of the valley, then you're able to echo the words of David, "I will fear no evil. I will not fear graduating without a job. I will not fear being single. I will not fear financial uncertainty. I will not fear not knowing what I'm going to be doing this summer. I will not fear a change in my wedding plans. I will not fear being quarantined for 2 weeks. I will not fear being home with my family." Why? Because you, the one who is always more, is with me. Last night, I got in bed late, and I just couldn't sleep. I just was tossing and turning, and my mind was kind of racing about what I needed to be doing for Breakaway. And as I was laying there in bed, this song came to mind. It's a song by Corey Asbury. It's called "Endless Hallelujah." And at the very end of the song, the last lyrics were this: "In the evening when I lay my head down, in the evening when I close my eyes, you're still the one I want to cling to. You're the last thought on my mind." And as I lay there in my bed and as I thought about those lyrics, I just said, "God, I just want to think tonight about who you are. Like, I'm going to put Breakaway aside and what I feel like I need to be doing for Breakaway. And as I lay here, I just want to spend the evening until I fall asleep. Would you just remind me of who you are?" What was happening in that moment? It was me realizing that I didn't fear God enough. But I wanted to turn my fear from my circumstances to my shepherd. And as I lay there and I was reminded of who my good shepherd was, you know what happens when you do that? fears of the valley get replaced by fear of your shepherd. So maybe if you're going to make it spiritually, maybe you need to change what you fear. The last thing that might need to change is simply what you expect. I want to encourage you with this. If you want to make it spiritually, you might need to change what you expect. You might need to change your expectations during this time. I just want to share with you the two most meaningful things to me in this passage. Like, these are the two things I always think of and I always come back to when I look at Psalm 23. The first thing is I love the fact that David says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I just find that wording interesting. It kind of conveys the image that David isn't in a rush to get through the valley. He's trusting God with the pace. It doesn't say, even though I run through the valley of the shadow of death, even though I crawl through the valley of the shadow of death. No, he's still on his feet. He hasn't succumbed to the valley. But he's also not in a rush to get through. That's the first thing that I always love. The second thing that I love is the shift in wording. For the first 3 verses, what does David say? He says, He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And then you get to verse 4, and what does he say? I will fear no evil. Why? For you are with me. Do you see the shift from distant to intimate? It's no longer he, it's you. God's no longer out in front leading. God is side by side escorting him, caring for him, lovingly leading him through the valley. And as I thought about that and I read Philip Keller's book, Philip Keller talks about one of the reasons that shepherds will take their sheep by way of the valleys to the mountaintop is because there are rivers and streams and springs and quiet pools in the deep defiles for sheep to be refreshed. The valleys, he says, are even some of the choicest meadows for sheep to feed on as they move toward the high country. Do you know what he's saying? He's saying even in the valleys, the sheep can find great nourishment. And so the reason that I just say you might need to change what you expect is because I think so many of us are in this mentality of, I just want to get through, like, let's just survive the coronavirus. Like, let's just get to the other side. Let's just get back to the time where school is back in person. Let's just get through Zoom school. Let's just get through this time where I'm stuck at home. I just want to get through it. I just want to make it through it. But don't neglect the fact of what David is saying. You know what David is saying? He's saying, in the valley, you know what happens? I'm not in a rush because as I walk through the valley, there's actually nourishment that my shepherd leads me to. Even in the valley, I find myself drawing closer to the Lord. He's shifting from he to you. So would you just believe that you could experience some of your most intimate moments with God in the midst of the coronavirus? So you have to make a choice. Like, you're never going to get this time back. And I know that we just want to look and say, man, I just can't wait for this to be over. But part of me wonders if we're going to look back and say, you know what? I had all of that time with no distractions to meet with God. I had all of that time to read my Bible. I had all of that time to get on my knees alone and pray to God. I had all of that time to seek the counsel of wise mentors and to read books on spiritual maturity. I had all of that time, and instead I wasted it. I was distracted by it. I gave it to Netflix. I gave it to social media. Would you just believe that this could be the moment that God has put you in this season to say, I want more of you? Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Would you believe that today could be your best day ever with Jesus Christ? Would you just allow yourself to transition from he to you? Would you just sense the nearness of God in this moment? We have to move from survival mode where we're just making it to surrendered mode where we are expectant for what God wants to do in our lives. Would you allow that shift to happen in your life? Would you change what you expect? Would you just not to expect to survive? Would you expect to see God move in your life? Would you submit to his leadership? Don't just survive. Surrender and let God move and work in your life. 3 things that might need to change if you're going to make it spiritually. You might need to change what you believe. Would you do that? Would you make a way for God leading you through the valleys? Would you allow the valleys to be his right paths for your life? And would you believe that he's not just leading you through, he's leading you to higher places with him? Would you change what you fear? Would you allow the fear of your shepherd to drown out the fears of the valley? And would you change what you expect? Instead of surviving, would you surrender? I'll close by saying this. You know what? Your shepherd will never lead you places that he has not already been himself. You know, at this coming weekend, we celebrate Easter, but right before Easter Sunday, there is Good Friday, and there's Maundy, Thursday, and you know what? Jesus Christ walked through the valley of the shadow of death himself. You know what? As he left the upper room where he shared the last meal with his disciples, you know what valley he crossed? He crossed through the Kidron Valley, where then he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. He sweat blood knowing that death was near. And then Judas brought the soldiers and arrested him. And then you know where they led him? They led him right back through the Kidron Valley and up to a place where he was then examined and condemned, where he was then crucified on a cross. Jesus Christ himself walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and he tasted death for you and for me. So in this moment, in this season, you know what you will question the most? You will question if your good shepherd truly cares. All you have to do is look at the cross, because on that cross, Jesus walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and he tasted death for you and for me. That's why he's a good shepherd, because the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. If you do not know Jesus Christ in a personal way, would you put your trust in him tonight, because he wants to be your shepherd? And if you already know him in a personal way, would you make some changes in your life so that you make it spiritually? Would you lean on your good shepherd who went to the cross for you and for me? He laid down his life for us.